When the conservative intellectual Shelby Steele and his filmmaker son Eli submitted What Killed Michael Brown to Amazon.com for distribution, the film was rejected. The official explanation given was that it didn't meet Prime Video's content quality expectations. But Shelby Steele and other conservatives were convinced that this was just corporate speak, covering up the real reason for the rejection. They thought that Steele's film, aimed as it was at exploding the myths that prop up a victim mentality in Black Americans, was simply not politically correct. But if the Amazon executives responsible for the decision were set on censorship, their effort backfired. Fox News and other conservative outlets cried foul, and instead of suppressing the movie, this rejection from Amazon only helped to promote it. What's more, Bezos blinked. What Killed Michael Brown is now available for purchase through Amazon Prime. And I think this is a good thing, because it provides content creators like myself with a framework to understand debates about race and class in America.
White supremacy was an enormously important force, idea in the world for centuries, and organized the entire globe, and it gave a coherence to the world.
There are two arguments or claims presented in Shelby Steele's film. The first is that the way the black struggle is understood by most Americans, and especially by liberal intellectuals, is simplistic to the point of being useless. The second argument is that the soft bigotry of low expectations has driven the expansion of the welfare state, and that together, the racism and the welfare state have stymied a black community from realizing itself through self-help and entrepreneurialism. This second claim, when asserted directly, seems absurd on its face. For a left audience, Steele might as well be recommending that poor black people invest their hopes in the power of prayer or in positive thinking.
The message we've chosen today was delivered by Dr. Peale in the Crystal Cathedral on January 25th, 1987. It is entitled, "Positive Thinking Works Wonders." Here is Dr. Norman Vincent Peale.
But when Shelby Steele is criticizing the liberal ideology that defines race in America, when he suggests that the underlying conditions that push so many black people into squalor are misunderstood, when he points to the fact that more black kids die from gun violence perpetrated by other black kids than die at the hands of police, his argument sounds more convincing. After all, racism is a symptom, an emergent attitude that reinforces or rationalizes existing social conditions, rather than a force that ultimately determines those conditions. By exploring the discrepancies between the official report on the Michael Brown killing and the narrative that took hold immediately after, Steele succeeds in undermining the prevailing assumptions about racial disparities in America. And when he goes after the Reverend Al Sharpton and others for seeking to profit off of a kind of grievance politics that can never remedy the ills that it decries, he almost sounds like a leftist.
And the extent therefore to which the sole actionable form of inequality that exists in either bourgeois practice or left discourse, ironically, now is disparity, right? Racial disparity, gender disparity, or whatever. Then that is at best, right, the sort of left wing, the sort of critical left self-consciousness of neoliberalism. But it's a metric of injustice that depends upon and exists entirely within the bourgeois framework.
Specifically, he almost sounds like Adolph Reed, who in his essay, What Are the Drums Saying, Booker, compared people like Cornel West, Henry Louis Gates, and Bell Hooks to the character Willie from the television program Ramar of the Jungle. Reed wrote, Whenever they hear drums in the distance, the whites summon their head bearer. They'll ask, Willie, what are the drums saying? Willie was, according to Reed, very similar to the new black public intellectuals that arose in the post-Jim Crow era, and that transformed from being people who would address three audiences, that is, a black community, white elites, and a transracial progressive political movement, into a group aimed at only one audience, namely a mostly white elite and academic audience. According to Reed, the new black intellectuals had to perform their blackness in order to establish their authenticity as surrogates for the muted black masses. And Sharpton performed this same function within the Democratic Party. Now, Shelby Steele would probably nod along with Reed on these points. Certainly, he would agree with Reed that Sharpton didn't represent any coherent political movement within the black community, but rather functioned as an alternative to the disruptive potential of an activated and engaged black electorate. Still, Shelby would break with Reed on the topic of social democratic reforms. The question of just what the black masses really desired is probably the primary point of distinction between the two public black intellectuals, and it's not a small distinction. After all, Reed dismisses Steele himself as being precisely the sort that the establishment cherishes, namely, a figure that can move from the left to the center by transforming a politics of grievance aimed at the white establishment to a politics of blame aimed at the black masses. But whether leftist or centrist, this approach to politics always targets attitudes and cultures. It always explains social problems in voluntaristic terms, and it always concerns itself with what goes on in the imagination. Hello, Zero Books readers and viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lain, and in this video I'll be finishing off my critique of Corneilius Castoriadis' book, The Imaginary Institution of Society, by considering how theories that sprang up to fill the space left behind when the left turned away from Marx's critique of political economy could lead both to Shelby Steele's film and to a left that is ill-prepared to counter his propaganda, Shelby Steele's propaganda. Along the way, I'll take some excerpts from Angela Nagle's book, Kill All Normies, and I'll paraphrase some concepts from Grafton Tanner's follow-up to his book on vaporwave called Babbling Corpses. But look, I solved it. If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and hit that bell. Even better, you should support us on Patreon. Patreon supporters get access to our Parrot Room, or private podcast conversations, as well as to podcasts about Rosa Luxemburg's Reform and Revolution, Gilles Dauvé's From Crisis to Communization, and Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. Support us on Patreon and join us in learning critical theory with the aim of changing society. In his upcoming book, The Circle of the Snake, Grafton Tanner considers how the nostalgia industry creates a sense of a frozen present. By touring the history of style, by treating time as if it presents a menu of moments that we can select between with a point and a click, we imagine ourselves as outside of history. We can't see, can't feel our own movement. We seem to be standing still, rather than being ourselves swept along by time and by a certain kind of logic. Tanner writes, and since tourists do not critically engage with what they watch, They operate in an atomized mode, separated from the watched object or event, as well as from other tourists who may also be watching. Detached from any historical reference and suffering from the amnesia of a fragmented present, the tourist injects present biases into the past. This feeling of being outside of time sometimes gives the impression that ideas and preferences are what shape the world. If everything comes down to a process of selection, then politics amounts to advertising. What matters most is influencing opinion, attitudes, and understanding, but not in order to inform a move or a movement, but rather in order to make sure that the right reality gets picked. Pepsi, not Coke. MTV, not VH1. CNN, and not Fox. And this is the esoteric meaning of Angela Nagle's book, Kill All Normies. While people focused on her lines mocking Tumblr's 52 genders and picked apart every other sentence for hints of reaction, what they missed was how she demonstrated that the alt-right shared some fundamental assumptions with the New Left. Both wings of bourgeois politics had taken what she described as a Gramscian turn. The idea that politics is downstream from culture, rather than being determined by material practices and the working out of economic relations, had dominated the right and the left, as they cut themselves off from history and began haggling over what to order off the menu. Describing the online culture war even as it continued to rage, even as she herself became a target and then a victim of the discourse. Nagle's primary contribution towards the development of socialist politics was the observation that in the post-war era, the left had become obsessed by culture. Facing the decline of a world historic proletarian struggle for socialism, the left theorized about the culture industry, about media hegemony, about the discourse, about narratives, about something called normativity, and about an ill-defined and abstract power. What some of them also worried away about was something called the imaginary. In his book, The Imaginary Institution of Society, the Greek-French radical Corneilius Castoriadis argued that rather than considering society as set atop political and economic relations, we should instead consider it as organized around meanings. Society was fundamentally inscrutable, irrational, and irreducible. Quote, societies can be neither described nor understood in their very functionality, except in relation to intentions, orientations, chains of significations, which not merely escape functionality, but to which functionality is in large part subservient. His argument is built upon a true observation. There is no function, no utility, that isn't embedded within cultural meaning. There is no meal, for example, that isn't in some way or another ethnic, or at least tied to a time and a place. Even Soylent can be seen as a product of a given moment in ideology. This idea of a purely functional meal, this powdered drink that provides the nutrients one needs without getting bogged down in any merely ornamental or ancillary concern about things as trivial as taste or texture, let alone any symbolism or meaning, is itself thoroughly drenched in the symbolism of Silicon Valley and the symbolism of efficiency in high-tech dreams. But that does not mean that Soylent was created solely to match the ideology alone. The same thing is true about race relations. Perhaps Steele is correct when he claims that the Pruitt-Igoe housing project was white America's way of controlling and containing a black population that they saw as a problem, as a symptom to be treated, rather than as a subject participating with and contributing to the American experiment. But when Steele suggests that the decline of the black family, for instance, the increase of the number of children raised by single mothers, or the increasing number of unemployed and or incarcerated black men, should all be laid at the feet of a white liberal establishment, it remains firmly within a now long-standing tradition of ignoring material reality. In 1965, 24% of black infants were born out of wedlock, while around 3% of white infants had unmarried mothers. By 1990, 64% of black infants had single mothers, and 18% of white babies were born to unwed mothers. But welfare payments have been declining since the 70s. Instead, what is the most likely cause of the increase in bastard children would be a combination of both economic and political factors. The rising demand for women workers, introduction of birth control, the precarity of work and rising unemployment rates for men and especially black men were much more important than the perverse incentives introduced by the welfare system, and it was much more important than the problem of patronizing white liberals. In 2016, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek told Big Think that there were not only wrong answers, but there were also wrong questions. And while the question, what killed Michael Brown, isn't wrong, the assumptions embedded in the question, the way that Steele remains within the framework of the culture war, the way he holds on to the idea that politics are downstream from culture, that certainly leads him astray. Shelby Steele assumes that the problems black people face should always be understood in terms of white power and white racism, even as he claims that the real racists are those who claim to be fighting racism. More than that, he assumes that cultural attitudes, that poetic truth, is where politics begin. In this way, I think that it's fair to say that Steele is a theorist of the imaginary. The fact that his politics are fundamentally conservative, that he is an advocate for a set of policies wherein the state and the government works in service of capitalism rather than in the service of humanity, just demonstrates that any politics based on imaginaries or on the imaginary is a dead end for revolutionaries and radicals. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.